This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Kevin Costner's The West, the thrilling story of the American settlement of the West.
In 1840, there were only an estimated around 8,000 non-indigenous people living in all of California, and virtually all of those were Spanish-speaking Californios. But that would change. Between 1841 and 1869, more than 250,000 people immigrated to California using the overland route called the California Trail. But of course, someone had to come first. In 1841, a hardy group of settlers set out for what they described as what seemed like paradise, with very little understanding of how to get there, except that California was to the west. The story of the first wagon train to California deserves to be remembered. You know I love history, and I credit that to my dad, who loved to watch Western movies and historical documentaries. And if you love history like I do, then you will almost certainly love Kevin Costner's The West, which is now playing on History, again, your premier destination for historical storytelling. The West is an enthralling series told via 8 compelling stories, each spotlighting a unique point in the epic tale of America's move westward. It expertly combines my passion for both history and a good story well told, weaving together expert interviews with the rich storytelling of the incomparable Kevin Costner. The West tells the story of America's westward expansion all the way through the closing of the American frontier. You know, next year America celebrates its 250th anniversary, and the settlement of the West is an important part of our story. I thoroughly enjoyed the series, and I think you will too.
Kevin Costner's The West. New episodes Monday, 9, 8 Central. Watch the next day on the History app, part of History Honors 250, only on the History Channel. John Bidwell was born in Chautauqua County, New York, in August 1819. In 1831, his family immigrated to Ohio. In 1890, his biography was published in Century magazine. In the spring of 1839, living at the time in the western part of Ohio, being then in my 20th year, I conceived a desire to see the great prairies of the West, especially those most frequently spoken of in Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. Immigration from the east was tending westward, and settlers had already begun to invade those rich fields. The adventurous spirit that would lead him on the path to the Pacific already showed. His first leg of the journey would be the 90-mile trek to Cincinnati, which he planned to do on foot, although he was in the end able to hitch a ride on a wagon load of farm products. America was already moving west, although most at the time had not dreamed of going as far west as Bidwell would go. Though traveling was considered dangerous, he wrote, I had no weapon more formidable than a pocket knife. Bidwell took the primary means of travel for the time, taking a steamboat down the Ohio to the Mississippi, then up to St. Louis and further north to the sparse Iowa territory, where he started to homestead, until all the people in the neighborhood became ill with fever, likely malaria. He moved to the part of Missouri called the Platte Purchase in the Northwest. He wrote, but even in Missouri there were drawbacks. Rattlesnakes and copperheads were abundant. One man, it was said, found a place to suit him, but on alighting from his horse heard so many snakes that he concluded to go further. At his second attempt, finding more snakes instead of fewer, he left the country altogether. He took a job as a school teacher, but when he took a trip to visit St. Louis, this trip proved to be my turning point in life. For while I was gone, a man had jumped my land. Generally, in such cases, public sentiment was against the jumper, and it was decidedly so in my case. But the scoundrel held on. He was a bully, had killed a man in Callaway County, and everybody seemed afraid of him. Bidwell's experience had already said much about life on the frontier, but this was Missouri, and to the west was a far more wild frontier, and he had decided to go there. Nearly all I had earned had been spent upon the land, and when that was taken, I lost about everything I had. There being no possibility of getting another claim to suit me, I resolved to go elsewhere when spring should open.
History can be fickle and turn on odd things. Were it not for a cantankerous land jumper, John Bidwell may not have blazed the trail that he did.
Another chance meeting gave Bidwell his idea for where. In November or December of 1840, while still teaching school in Platte County, I came across a Frenchman named Robideau, who said that he had been to California. The Frenchman gave a glowing description of a land of perennial spring and boundless fertility, and laid stress on the countless thousands of wild horses and cattle. He told about oranges, and hence must have been at Los Angeles, or the mission of San Gabriel a few miles from it. He insisted that there was no illness there. He said there was but one man in California who had ever had a chill, and it was a matter of so much wonderment to the people of Monterey that they went 18 miles in the country to see him shake. He described the Spanish authorities, and even the local Indians, as friendly, His description of the country made it seem like a paradise. Bidwell immediately helped to form a committee called the Western Immigration Committee to make a plan to go to California. It was an audacious choice. There was no established land route, and the suddenly enthusiastic subscribers from as far away as Arkansas appeared to have no idea what lay in between, or how to get there except to head west.
But he did have an advantage, because while there weren't very many Americans yet in California, there was at least one.
John Marsh was born in Massachusetts in 1799. He attended Harvard and studied medicine. He'd moved west to Michigan, had been an Indian agent and also a justice of the peace. In 1836, a job with the American Fur Company had taken him to Santa Fe, then part of Spanish Mexico, and he had gone from there to California. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote in 2006, Marsh was the first non-Hispanic settler to live in Contra Costa, the owner of a vast rancho and one of the richest men in California. He was a Harvard graduate and for a time was the only doctor in California. Marsh's new rancho, near now what is Brentwood, was considered the edge of the world. The nearest house to the east was 1,000 miles away. Marsh would play an important role in bringing the wagon trains west. In a 1931 biography, California historian George Lyman writes, he wanted a great rancho cattle, riches, and security, but he did not want them if he could not hold them. Influenced by these ambitions, his great desire became annexation of California to the United States. Marsh sent letters to friends in Missouri extolling the virtue of the state. More importantly, Lyman explains, Marsh had a good idea of the country lying between the Missouri and the Sierras, and he figured out a route which, he said, was direct, with good pasturage and water all the way. He also mailed copies of this route to his friends in Missouri, who spread the news. The route would follow much of the already established Oregon Trail, turning off near Fort Hall in Idaho. Lyman writes, on their arrival in Jackson County, Missouri, these letters caused a great commotion. As a result of the stories of Roubidoux and more concrete evidence of Marsh's letters, the Western Immigration Society came into being. At first, Bidwell notes, there was great enthusiasm. In a short time, I think within a month, we had about 500 names. But, Lyman writes, when spring arrived, the enthusiasm of the would-be immigrants had cooled. The online education site Spartacus writes, Missouri shopkeepers, fearing a rapid decline in customers, decided to mount a campaign against the idea. Local newspapers published stories about the dangers of traveling overland to California. Also, a great deal of publicity was given to Thomas Farnham's Travels in the Great Western Prairies. In the book, Farnham described in detail the hardships people would face on the journey. Bidwell writes, local merchants of Platte County had all along protested against our going, and had tried from the beginning to discourage and break up the movement, saying it was the most unheard of, foolish, wild goose chase that ever entered into the brain of man for 500 people to pull up stakes, leave that beautiful country, and go away out to a region that we knew nothing of. This being the first movement across the Rocky Mountains to California, it's not surprising, Bidwell said, that it suffered reverses before we were fairly started. In the spring, less than 100 people showed up. Bidwell was, however, still enthused, despite the fact that our ignorance of the route was complete. We knew that California lay west, and that was the extent of our knowledge. On May 18, 1841, those who arrived rendezvoused, and the man after whom the expedition is often named was chosen. Bidwell writes, we organized by electing as captain of the company a man named Bartleson from Jackson County, Missouri. John Bartleson was born in 1786 in Rowan County, North Carolina, to parents Zachariah and Catherine, one of 7 children. The Bartlesons were originally from New Jersey and were artisan chairmakers. They left for North Carolina due to the scarcity of timber. The family traveled to Kentucky, and then Bartleson had traveled further west, helping to found Clay County, Missouri. The Martin City, Missouri Telegraph writes, when Clay County, Missouri was organized in 1822, the population of the entire county was about 1,200 people. When the first court case was filed in Clay County a year later, John Bartleson served on the very first jury. By 1840, Bartleson, along with his wife and 4 children, was living in Jackson County when he heard about the Western Immigration Society. Librarian Nancy Meeks writes on her webpage, Goldfields, John Bartleson wasn't the oldest man in the company, but he was older than most. The majority of men were, like John Bidwell, in their 20s. Bartleson was born in October 1786, making him 54 years old when they set out from Missouri. He was part of the Childs mess, made up of Joseph B. Childs, Michael Nye, and some German immigrants. When they joined the company, he insisted on being made captain, probably feeling that as older and more experienced man, he was more qualified to lead the group. Bidwell writes, he was not the best man for the position, but we were given to understand that if he was not elected captain, he would not go, and he had 7 or 8 men with him, and we didn't want the party diminished. so he was chosen. But the party did have a stroke of luck. Bidwell writes, "In 5 days after my arrival, we were ready to start, but no one knew where to go, not even the captain. Finally, a man came up, one of the last to arrive, and announced that a company of Catholic missionaries were on their way from St. Louis to the Flathead Nation of Indians, with an old Rocky Mountaineer for a guide, and that if we would wait another day, they would be up with us." The Rocky Mountaineer was an experienced trapper named Thomas Fitzpatrick. The party consisted of 69 people, in addition to the 17 members of the missionary party. Accompanying the missionary expedition, something that was mutually beneficial, took them past Oregon Trail landmarks such as Courthouse Rocks, Chimney Rock, and Scotts Bluffs. They hunted buffalo, had mostly peaceful encounters with the natives, and blazed a trail. Bidwell writes, "Guided by Fitzpatrick, we crossed the Rockies at or near the South Pass, where the mountains were apparently low. Some years before, a man named William Sublette, an Indian fur trader, went to the Rocky Mountains with goods in wagons, and those were the only wagons that had ever been there before us." For being the first wagon train along the Oregon Trail, the party had seen relatively little mishap. Their only casualty was one member of the party, ironically named Shotwell, who accidentally shot himself to death while pulling his gun from a wagon near the Platte River. One man had chosen to leave the party at Fort Laramie, and 3 more had decided to turn back along the way. The party included 64 when it came time to split with the missionary group, but Bidwell writes, 32 of our party, becoming discouraged, decided not to venture without path or guide into the unknown and trackless region towards California, but concluded to go with the missionary party to Fort Hall and thence find their way down Snake and Columbia rivers into Oregon. Thus, 32 people, including just one woman, 17-year-old Nancy Kelsey, and her 1-year-old daughter Martha Ann, took a trail that had only been suggested by the travels of a few trappers. Expedition member John Childs would later recall, "It was considered almost rash for a woman to venture on so perilous a journey, but Mrs. Kelsey said that where my husband goes, I can go. I can better withstand the hardships of the journey than the anxieties for an absent husband." Difficulty really started as the party headed south, unclear as to where to find water and where to turn west. Advice from trappers warned them as they went by Salt Lake, "Be careful not to go too far south, lest we should get into a waterless country without grass." They also said we must be careful not to go too far north, lest we should get into a broken country and steep canyons, and wander about, as trapping parties have been known to do, and become bewildered and perish. The party nearly did both. Struggling with the trail and access to water, they were forced to abandon the wagons, carrying everything in a pack train, which proved difficult with the oxen, as their packs often broke free. Bidwell writes, "Horses became scared, mules kicked, oxen jumped and bellowed, and articles were scattered in all directions." Tension rose with the expedition leader. The Martin City Telegraph writes, Bartleson approached Bidwell on October 7th. He wrote that Bartleson found fault with enough and wasn't going to stand for it any longer, that he was going to California and all who could keep up with him might go with him and the rest could go to hell. Bartleson and his group went ahead, only to come back starved and defeated a week later. The Telegraph writes, John Bartleson and his men had eaten fish and pine nuts to survive, and all the men were very sick. Bidwell noted Captain Bartleson, who when we started was a portly man, was reduced to half his former girth. The Utah Historical Quarterly explains the party experienced the most trying adventures, failing to find any pass over the Sierras, becoming lost and being continually at the point of starvation. When their oxen were gone, the horses were eaten, and when the horses were gone, they existed on coyotes, wildcats, crows, and anything that they were fortunate enough to find. Childs recalled, they had learned through Dr. Marsh's letters the latitude of San Francisco Bay, and they thought the sun was sufficient to guide them there. But also the journey proved longer than they supposed, and they were tired and hungry. Long before they reached that point, they had been subsisting on horseflesh almost entirely, and that not of the choicest kind. But little game could be found on that part of the journey, and other provision was not known. Almost entirely on foot, they made it to John Marsh's ranch on November 4th. Despite the hardship, all 32 made it through. Childs writes, imagine the wild delight of so many hungry men, one might say starving men. The website Celebrate California writes the 32 new Californians had traveled more than 1,730 miles over 5.5 months. Prior to their arrival, the white population in California is estimated at 100. Buoyed by the Bidwell-Bartleson party success, wagon trains grew in size and number each subsequent year. California proved difficult for them. Marsh was not as accommodating as promised, and the government proved hostile, and members of the party were briefly detained, although they eventually received Mexican citizenship. The party was truly extraordinary. Bidwell became a wealthy landowner, entered politics, served both in the California Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, and founded the city of Chico, California. He made a land donation to a normal school that is now California State University at Chico. Joseph Childs returned east via Santa Fe and then led 7 wagon trains from Missouri to California before settling in California and becoming a wealthy landowner. Nancy Kelsey, the first white woman to travel overland to California, lived to the age of 73. During the short-lived Bear Flag Rebellion in 1845, she sewed the eponymous flag, earning the sobriquet the Betsy Ross of California. She told an interviewer shortly before her death in 1893, "I have enjoyed riches and suffered the pangs of poverty. I've seen U.S. Grant when he was little known. I have baked bread for General Fremont and talked to Kit Carson. I have run from bear and killed most all other kinds of smaller game." One of the oddest tales was that of expedition member Talbot Green, who was described as friendly and cultured. He found success in business in San Francisco, where he was popular and was elected to the city council. But when he decided to run for mayor, he was recognized. His name was actually Paul Geddes, and he had escaped west after embezzling substantial amounts of funds from a Philadelphia bank. John Bartleson, after whom the party is often named, became quickly disenfranchised with California. While trying to cross the Sierra, he had said, "Boys, if I ever get back to Missouri, I will never leave there again. Why, I'd be glad to eat from the same trough with my dogs there." By 1842, he returned to Missouri along the Santa Fe Trail with 6 other men. The Martin City Telegraph writes, "John Bartleson's mark in American history was likely his biggest personal failure, as the trip warranted him no financial gain or personal recognition in his lifetime."
Historian Doyce Nunes wrote of the Bartleson-Bidwell party in 1999 that these hardy pioneers were the harbingers of many thousands to come. While they did make it through, it wasn't until 4 years later, in 1845, that another wagon train, with the help of a Paiute chief, identified a route that was viable for wagons. The members of the Bartleson-Bidwell party endured enormous hardships, and yet they all made it through alive, something that might surprise you if you ever played the game Oregon Trail. But in doing so, they proved that traveling overland to California was possible. The hardy pioneers were simply representing the restlessness of their time. Bidwell wrote, "At that time when a man moved out west, as soon as he got settled, he wanted to move again." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop and book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.